We're rolling.
People are throwing money at me. All right. The full introduction that you were promised. Jim Shedlowsky is a longtime member of the Warren Astronomical Society. He's a former treasurer of the club. And he is a rockabilly legend with the Ski Brothers, who I think it was the Ski Bros. He appeared on Dick Clark's Bandstand in 1958 during the time span of this presentation. But he's not done yet. In 2015, the Ski Brothers released their first album I think maybe their first full-length album called That's All She Wrote after 57 years, which I am the proud owner of a copy. Jim's astronomical interests include observation and outreach, both here and in Arizona. In recent years, his passion for astronomical history and technology has kind of taken over. He's spent time at the McMath-Hulbert Astronomical Society and is actively involved in Arizona where he overwinters. In his career, he worked for 36 years as a vehicle development engineer and manager at General Motors, retiring in 1999. So he is perhaps one of the few people in the club who has successfully completed a Messier marathon, and that is something that more of us need to do. So Jim's perspective on engineering comes through in his talks, and without further ado, I give you Jim Shedlowsky for the grand finale.
Since Jonathan has used up 5 minutes of my time, I hope I can finish the presentation. By the way, I only got 103 of the 110 messages, but I did it in one night. Let me find my mouse here.
Fraud.
Korolev, who was he? How did he start the space race? So who was this Korolev guy? And how was he able to bring a seemingly unsophisticated, war-torn country to a state of superiority vis-a-vis the United States in the field of rocket science? The very essence of technical sophistication. After all, it is rocket science. The very essence of technical sophistication. In February of 1956, when the request meeting that I talked about earlier with Khrushchev and the Politburo occurred, he was a 49-year-old mastermind of the Soviet rocket missile, but not yet space industry, who had risen in 10 years from the status of an ex-con to become the go-to guy in the Soviet Union, for first Joseph Stalin and then Nikita Khrushchev, for directing one of their highest national priority programs. He was the chief designer and the leader of the Council of Chief Designers, which he had formed. In the next decade, he would go on to achieve the many firsts in space travel that were listed earlier. But at this point in his career, in 1956, he needed first to fulfill his promises to Khrushchev, which he initially did by launching the world's first successful ICBM, an R-7 Semyorka. By the way, this little model down here that Mike provided is a model of that very spacecraft. He launched that first successful ICBM on 21st of August. Be careful, it comes apart easily.
The nuclear warhead, so what's that?
He launched the first successful ICBM on 21st of August, 1957, gathering the anxious attention of the U.S. military, which would not match this feat for nearly 2 years. This historic flight delivered an 11,000-pound warhead some 3,700 miles, right on target, thus exposing the continental United States to a thermonuclear threat for the first time in history. While this event raised Cold War fears and initiated the missile gap debate used effectively by John Kennedy in the 1958 presidential race, its significance was overshadowed just a few weeks later on October 4th, 1957, when Korolev, using another R-7 launcher, placed the world's first satellite, Sputnik, into Earth orbit. A much simplified version of the original D1 that he'd shown Khrushchev a few years earlier, to beat the Americans to the amazement of the entire planet. This 23-inch, 184-pound silver sphere with its twin radio transmitters beat signals to the world, proclaiming Soviet technical prowess, and created a world reaction that was immediate and intense. In addition to the beep, beep, beeping heard by radio operators, visual sightings with the naked eye were reported from around the globe. Seeing Sputnik, often with the brilliance of a star as it moved swiftly across the sky, left a profound impression on all observers. Actually, the observers were seeing the 90-foot-long second stage on which Korolev had put reflective panels. Since Sputnik was so small, it was almost impossible to really see it. The image of the Soviet Union as a nation of backward technology was thoroughly dispelled, and the Americans began to doubt our military and technological superiority vis-à-vis the Russians. Von Braun and his boss, General Medeiros, received the news of Sputnik's success while hosting Neil Armstrong, the brand new Secretary of Defense, at a reception at the Officers Club at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville. Von Braun, usually unflappable, very nearly exploded with anger and frustration. "We knew they would do it! We could have done it 2 years ago," he said. He referred to the fact that the former Secretary of Defense, Charlie Wilson, had directly ordered General Medeiros to inspect every Jupiter C launch to ensure that Von Braun didn't accidentally launch a satellite. Von Braun went on to implore McElroy, "For God's sakes, cut us loose and let us do something. We have the hardware on the shelf. Vanguard will fail. And finally, we can put up a satellite in 60 days, Mr. McElroy. Just give us the green light and 60 days. But they were a day late and $1 short. The Soviets, meanwhile, were gloating big time, and Nikita Khrushchev was astounded at the world reaction to Sputnik. Several days later, on October 10th, he met with Korolev in Moscow to congratulate him and to request a new triumph in time for the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. On November 7th, only 26 days away, Korolev incredibly proposed that a second, more sophisticated satellite be launched, this time with a dog as a passenger. With innovative ideas, a huge effort, and a lot of improvisation, Sputnik 2 was designed and built from scratch in time to meet a November 3rd liftoff aboard another R-7 rocket. A dog named Laika became the first living creature to be orbited into space. Laika survived the launch in a few orbits, but was not intended to be brought back to Earth. Sputnik 2 weighed over 1,100 pounds, a quantum leap up from Sputnik 1, and the military implications were ominous. The Soviets obviously had at their disposal the means to deliver a nuclear missile to any point on Earth. The unprecedented success of 2 Sputnik flights in 1 month and the lack of a U.S. response caused a great deal of unease in the American public. Anybody that was around then will remember that. This was followed up several months later with the orbiting of the original D1 satellite that I showed you earlier, weighing in at nearly 3,000 pounds, as compared to von Braun's meager 30-pound Explorer 1, which was America's entry into the satellite contest on January 31st, 1958. Korolev's unprecedented Sputnik successes, remember he was still unknown to the Western world, caused the world community to question, how did the Soviets reach this point in rocket science technology? To answer that question, one must consider three significant but little known bits of Soviet history, unknown or overlooked by Western scholars. First, it was a Russian pioneer who first formulated the basic principles governing the behavior of reaction devices, or rockets, and the early concepts for spaceships for interplanetary travel. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who predated his Western counterparts, Goddard in America and Oberth in Germany, by decades, with the mathematics of rocket science and analysis of many challenges of manned and unmanned operations in space. He developed the fundamental equation of liquid fuel rocket performance. He published nearly 100 books and articles on space travel and related subjects, and produced concepts and designs for such things as multi-stage boosters, space stations, rockets with steering thrusters, airlocks for exiting spaceship, and closed-cycle biological systems to provide food and oxygen for space colonies, among many related subjects. Tsiolkovsky's writings at the beginning of the 20th century influenced his Russian contemporaries, such as Nikolai Kibuchich and Yuri Kondrachev. But after the formation of the Soviet Union, after the revolution, they were more widely disseminated and formed the intellectual basis for an enthusiastic interest in space travel matters, as exemplified by the fact that between 1921 and 1932, nearly 250 articles and 30 non-fiction books about spaceflight were published in the Soviet media, in contrast to only 2 in America. In Moscow in 1924, a talented young engineer named Friedrich Sander joined Tsiolkovsky in forming the world's first space club, the Society for the Study of Interplanetary Travel. This led to the Great Soviet Space Exhibit held in Moscow in the spring of 1927, the world's first such show to address this theme, which attracted huge crowds. Russia was in the midst of the world's first space craze, just as their first generation of space pioneers was coming of age. By 1930, the 44-year-old seasoned rocket science had recruited a new convert to the cause, a 24-year-old aircraft engineer named Sergei Korolev. Korolev was a Ukrainian born in Kiev in 1907, and his interest in aircraft began early when in 1913 he was taken by his grandfather to an air demonstration by a famous Russian barnstorming pilot named Sergei Utichkin, only 10 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. In 1917, his family moved to Odessa, a Ukrainian seaport town, and lived through the harrowing days of the Russian Revolution. It was here in his early teens that Sergei got his first airplane ride with the commander of the Odessa hydroplane squadron stationed there. He loved hanging out at that base and working with the mechanics and aviators. The period from 1918 to 1921 was turbulent in Odessa as the various factions, both domestic and foreign, fought out the revolutions in the streets of the city, with the civilian privations that accompanied this. These first-hand experiences were said to have influenced Korolev's exceptional ability to see the essence of a man. He was a voracious student who devoured books on math and physics, and as the new Soviet state was formed with an emphasis on vocational and technological training, he was in on the ground floor, graduating in 1924 from the vocational school with competence in mathematics, physics, strength of material, Russian, Ukrainian, German, and mechanical drawing, among other subjects. Since his main love was aviation, he enrolled in the Kiev Polytechnical School in 1924, which is a school that Igor Sikorsky, the founder or the inventor of the helicopter, went to. And on to Moscow State Technical School in 1926, where he studied under Andrei Tupolev, one of Russia's most famous aircraft designers, and who would become an important figure in his near future. At both schools, he was very active in their glider clubs and designed, built, and piloted his own prize-winning SK-4 stunt glider in the 1929 competition at Koptevel, Ukraine. In December of 1929, he defended his two-seater light airplane design and several weeks later received his degree as a, quote, qualified aero-mechanical engineer. He went on to get his pilot's license in 1930, but his professional interest had begun to be influenced by the space craze that was sweeping the Soviet Union, and he probably had visited the great Soviet space exhibit in 1927 that I mentioned a moment ago. It is likely that he would there met Frederick Sander in this period and been persuaded that rockets were a coming thing. In 1931, Korolev and Sander helped form a research group in Moscow named, quote, the Group for the Study of Reaction Propulsion, or GIRD, or GERD, which was the world's first large professional rocketry organization with Korolev as its overall director. In 1933, this group was merged with a Leningrad group called the Gas Dynamics Lab, which had been doing work on various rocket engines, to form an expanded group known as the Reaction Propulsion Research Institute, or RMII, which launched the Soviet Union's first successful liquid-fueled rockets, the GERD-X, on November 11, 1933. The consolidated RMII organization consisted of about 85 people, with some 25 engineers, including 2 that would become important associates for Korolev for the rest of his career, Mikhail Tikhonravov and Valentin Glushko. You'll hear those names later in the report. The RMII had a test range, a fabrication shop, a wind tunnel, test stands, and the like. Activities covered a wide range of research into applications of rockets that might have prospects for military weapons. They designed, built, and tested a wide variety of configurations for rockets themselves, as well as studying fuel types, guidance systems, cruise missiles, rocket-assisted aircraft, and other related technology. During this period, from 1931 to 1937, the year I was born, the RMII organization quietly led the world in this new technology called rocket science. In America, Goddard's modest efforts were technically advanced, but he had no support. And in Germany, von Braun and company were just gearing up, but the R-06 rocket launched by the RMII in 1937 likely held the altitude record of 4 kilometers until the first successful V-2 launch 5 years later in 1942. The groundbreaking development work at RMII was profoundly affected in June of 1937 by the arrest of General Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who had been its prime supporter as part of his efforts to modernize the Soviet military. Tukhachevsky was unfortunately also one of Stalin's main rivals, and his arrest and subsequent execution was a key element of Stalin's purge of the Soviet military in his 1936 to 1938, quote, reign of terror. In early 1938, several leaders in the RMII organization were also executed, and in March, Glushko received an 8-year sentence. Finally, on June 27, 1938, Korolev received that knock on the door in the middle of the night from the NKVD and was arrested, charged, and sentenced to 10 years at hard labor. He was sent to a notorious gulag in far eastern Siberia known as Kolyma, a gold mining camp where he suffered privations causing permanent damage to his health, including the loss of all of his teeth, a broken jaw, and heart problems which would contribute to his relatively early death. In September 1940, Korolev was transferred by request of his old college professor, Andrei Tubalov, who had himself been arrested in October of '37, to his sharaga. A sharaga was another unique part of the Soviet penal system. Sharagas were special design and technical bureaus where important work for the state was accomplished, and where the food and accommodations were much more humane. Korolev was put to work on various aircraft design projects, including the Tu-2 light bomber. He was then transferred in 1943 to another sharaga, where he joined another group of distinguished prisoner engineers, which included his RNII teammate Glushko, and began working on jet engines and again on liquid-fueled rocket engines. In the summer of 1944, after 7 years as a prisoner, he was exonerated and his prior convictions expunged. Then, in late summer 1945, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, Korolev was commissioned a colonel in the Red Army, and on September 8, 1945, he flew to Berlin to join other colleagues gathering information about the work of the German rocket scientists. This trip began the second phase of how the Soviets reached this level of prominence in rocket science in the late 50s. This important factor was their aggressive and successful pursuit of the advanced technologies developed by the Germans under the direction of Wernher von Braun at their Rocket Development Center in Peenemünde between 1937 and 1945. By early May 1945, with the suicide of Hitler, World War II in Europe was coming to an end, but not before the dramatic use of a revolutionary new weapon, the V-2 rocket, which had been developed at the German Rocket Development Center at a place called Peenemünde. More than 3,000 of these 15-ton missiles with a 1-ton warhead had been fired in a 6-month campaign. 1,360 of them directed at London. The size and sophistication of the V-2 amazed the first Soviet scientist, who in 1944, when sent to inspect the wreckage of a test V-2 which had crashed in Poland, declared, "This is what cannot be!" A completely new class of weapon had been born. By the end of February 1945, with the war over, with the approach of the Soviet Union from the west, Peenemünde had been destroyed by the Germans and over 4,000 employees evacuated to central Germany. On May 11th, the American forces attacking from the east overran the infamous Mittelwerk V-2 factory built into a mountain near Nordhausen and cleaned it out of over 100 V-2 rockets to be shipped to the United States, along with 15 tons of technical documents and drawings that von Braun had hidden in a nearby mine shaft. This was done just in time to meet the June 1st deadline to turn that region over to the Soviets per Allied agreements. Von Braun and his key staff had surrendered to the American forces on May 2nd, and by the end of 1945, he and over 100 of his key Peenemünde staff were reunited with their V-2s in the white sands of the New Mexico desert. When the Soviets finally take possession of the Mittelwerk V-2 factory in June of 1945, they find it mostly empty. Furthermore, in the chaos and confusion of the first months of Soviet occupation of Germany, with representatives of different Soviet industries eagerly taking possession of German know-how and hardware they were familiar with, there was no existing Soviet rocket science industry to capture the extensive rocket development infrastructure of Nazi Germany that was left over by the Americans. For several months, chaos existed. Various industrial and military entities puzzled over who should be responsible for all the bits and pieces of hardware and remaining junior rocket personnel that were being discovered. Moscow, and in particular Joseph Stalin, apparently saw the V-2 as only a tactical weapon, a longer range extension of conventional artillery. After all, with over 3,000 V-2s fired during World War II, only 7,000 people were killed. The casualties of one large-scale bombing raid. Then on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, two events caused a major revision in his assessment. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which finally ended World War II. The nuclear age had arrived, and with it, a rethinking of the potential role of a ballistic missile. This got Stalin's attention in a major way, and 10 days later, he signed a decree to establish a, quote, special committee to develop a Soviet atomic bomb. Several weeks later, on September 8, 1945, Korolev had already visited Peenemünde, was sent to Berlin to survey the state of various efforts going on in East Germany to recover German V-2 technologies, such as guidance systems, aerodynamic, rocket engines, and the like left behind by the Americans. By mid-September, the Soviets had recruited Helmut Grothrup, a German senior expert for von Braun at Peenemünde on the V-2's guidance system and control system, who in turn recruited other German technical experts to join these efforts. In December of 1945, Korolev and his military boss, Dmitry Ustinov, founded NI-88 that we talked about, where Khrushchev got his message earlier. The initial Soviet Missile Development Center at Podliki, later Kaliningrad, now just northeast of Moscow. In February of 1946, they established the Institute Nordhausen with Korolev as chief engineer to coordinate all of the rocket science recovery efforts going on in Germany. By October 1946, over 700 Russians and 5,000 to 7,000 Germans were involved throughout East Germany, where Korolev's organizational skills, his excellent decision-making, dynamic leadership, which reinforced his demonstrated technical grasp of the emerging field of rocket science from his RNII days of the 30s, it made him the acknowledged leader of the Soviet efforts. Efforts were underway in Germany to completely recreate the V-2's design documentation and to find or reproduce enough hardware to build a dozen or so V-2s at a plant in Kleinebodden, while sending parts for another dozen back to the NI-88 in Russia. All of these activities involved Soviet and German teams, with the Soviet engineers learning the V-2 technology. Live V-2 testing was carried on by Valentin Glushko, Korolev's old RNII comrade, while guidance and control systems were studied at Blecher-Rodin. Keep in mind now that while the Americans had cleaned the place out, they only had a couple of weeks to do it. There were hundreds of companies in East Germany that had participated in the V-2 program, and they were still there, and that's what the Russians were mining. On April 17, 1946, a report on the rocket activities was given to Stalin with proposals for future developments in this field. Stalin, finally convinced that of the strategic significance of a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead, took several decisive steps, and on May 13, 1946, issued a decree which created a top-secret Special Committee on Reactive Technology, similar to the Committee on the Atomic Bomb Development, which clarified the chain of command and wrapped it all up in secrecy. As a result of these decisions, it was ordered that all rocket development work in Germany going forward would be conducted in the Soviet Union. Subsequently, on October 26, 1946, 177 members of Grotrup's rocket team and their families, totaling some 500 Germans, were kidnapped, loaded onto trains, and shipped to the Soviet Union, where they would remain for the next 4 to 6 years. This led on April 14, 1947, to Korolev being summoned by Stalin to a key meeting of the Commission for the Development of a Long-Range Plan for Rocket Technology Development. Korolev was ready with a plan, which strongly suggested that the V2 technology, which was being copied at Podlicki per Stalin's orders, was out of date, even though mastering it had been an important step. Korolev stressed that the new technologies with larger rocket engines, with more advanced fuel, stronger fuel pumps, more advanced guidance systems, and more effective launch techniques were required. All of this some 6 months before the Soviets had even launched their first hand-built V2 with the help of their German partners. Stalin was adamant that Korolev must first master the V2, but he was very impressed by Korolev and his vision. Stalin's support was the ultimate key element to priority and resources in the Soviet system at this time. Korolev understood this reality and he mastered its use in the years to come. Meanwhile, the Germans, who were now in Russia, were initially assigned to work with their Soviet counterparts in various departments of the Soviet development effort, but were gradually consolidated as a separate group on Korolev Island in Lake Seliger, about 200 miles northwest of Moscow, where they were assigned various design projects in isolation from the main Soviet efforts. They had modest test and fabrication facilities on the island. Grotrop's group essentially reported to Korolev, but seldom met him directly. They were asked to provide designs for several longer-range missiles, none of which were ever built, but which provided many significant design features which were copied by the competing Soviet designs, which did become the operational R1, R2, and R5 that I mentioned earlier, and subsequently in the R7. They were occasionally called back to Moscow to help solve problems, and on October 1947, a team of German engineers were included to participate in the test launches of the first series of V2s at the new Soviet missile range at Kasputn Yar, some 600 miles southeast of Moscow. This was an important admission that the Soviets were still learning the ropes from the Germans. However, by June of '53, the repatriation of the Germans began. By then, the Soviets had milked their ideas and, led by Korolev, were well into their own long-range rocket developments, with an ICBM as their top priority. The Germans had contributed substantially to Korolev's efforts with meaningful improvements in engine design, aerodynamics, control systems, and the overall missile architecture, but now the Soviets were on their own. After the May 14, 1947 meeting that I mentioned earlier of Korolev with Stalin, now with a directive from Stalin which provided the authority and backing necessary, Korolev began organizing the many various resources which would be required to accomplish the task of creating a Soviet missile industry from the hodgepodge of complex Soviet military, scientific, educational, and industrial system. For the next 2 decades, his impressive abilities to effectively achieve outstanding results in spite of many obstacles is a testimony to his talents as a visionary, an engineer, a manager, and a supreme decision maker, but mainly as a leader of leaders, and importantly, a leader of individuals. He was stubborn but flexible. He was bombastic but forgiving. He was willing to take risks with new ideas, but cautious in the execution of them. He was a good listener and receptive to new ideas. He was tireless in achieving goals. He had no tolerance for sloppiness, dishonesty, or deceit when the chips were down. He was a man feared by some, loved by many, but respected by all, and absolutely dedicated to his mission. In November of 1947, Korolev organized a Council of Chief Designers, which operated as an informal and separate entity from the other institutes and design bureaus, and eventually assumed engineering control over much of the early development of the Soviet missile and space program. Korolev himself was a leader of this council, and he used this group's consensus as a powerful leverage in dealing with the rest of the confusing Soviet apparatus. With a technical consensus from the Council and backing from Stalin, often the impossible became possible. And it seemed that Korolev had become the master planner and coordinator. By early 1953, Stalin gone, Korolev was beginning to set specifications and configurations for the first Soviet ICBM. Several events interrupted this process. Stalin's death in March of 1953 meant that Korolev's most important benefactor was gone, and he needed to reestablish his credentials with the new Politburo, including Nikita Khrushchev. Apparently this happened quickly, as Khrushchev mentioned in his memoirs. "We had absolute confidence in Comrade Korolev. We believed him when he told us that his rocket would not only fly, but that it would travel 7,000 kilometers. He expounded or defended his ideas. You could see the passion burning in his eyes, and his reports were always models of clarity. He had unlimited energy and determination, and he was a brilliant organizer." Also in August of '53, the Soviets had exploded their first hydrogen bomb after only 10 months after the US. And this had a major impact on Korolev's direction, since it changed the weight of the warhead of the planned missile from a 3-ton atomic bomb to a 5-ton thermonuclear device. This requirement was based on a hasty initial estimate by Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet H-bomb, for the weight of a mature hydrogen warhead. It turned out that this estimate was high by several orders of magnitude, but its specification at this crucial time called for an increased rocket lifting capability, which would be very productive for years, that is, decades to come. And Korolev immediately realized this fact. The missile and booster system that Korolev created from these basic requirements and designated R7 came from a configuration suggested by Korolev's comrade Tikhon Rabov called a packet design, which is essentially a 1.5 stage system with a central sustainer section surrounded by 4 boosters which operate together at liftoff and then separate after launch. It's my understanding that they were not quite sure that they could achieve a restart of an engine once it left the launch pad and got out into space or into altitude. So they wanted to start all the engines at the same time on the ground. This configuration, coupled with 5 of the newly developed Rushko RD-1078 engines, would provide the R7 with the capabilities required. Now, all Korolev had to do was to solve a multitude of significant problems to deliver a system that worked as an ICBM and then later as a vehicle to fulfill some of Korolev's lifetime dreams. This little model here that Mike brought in is one of an R7. Some of these problems are shown on this slide. The Tsiolkovsky equation and the basic ICBM requirements allowed Korolev to calculate the mass and thrust required, but engineering and packaging of such a vehicle required sophisticated solutions to complicated structural, electrical, hydraulic, and aerodynamic issues. In particular, for a 5,000-mile flight, would a full ballistic trajectory be accurate enough, or would mid-flight corrections be required with a downrange tracking system? Would the missile's flight be controlled by a gimbaled engine, exhaust vanes, or what? How does the warhead survive the severe heat load on re-entry? What kind of launch system and facility could handle the size and complexity of such a system? And could the known pogo vibration problem be dealt with the 5 engines and 20 combustion chambers of Glushko's power plant? Each of these and many other issues would challenge Korolev's by now legendary management, decision-making, and leadership capabilities. New technical institutes and engineering departments were created. A huge launch complex, later known as Baikonur, was built, new materials were developed, and vast amounts of resources, manpower, and money were expended, mostly directed by Sergei Korolev. In the 1953 to 1957 timeframe, while Korolev was dealing with these daunting problems, the Americans were working on the same issues with their first generation ICBM, but with a very significant difference in the designated warhead weight. As I mentioned earlier, Korolev was told to design for an 11,000-pound warhead, while the Atlas D would only need to deliver a 3,000-pound payload. This over-design by the Soviets meant that the R-7 booster would have much more lifting capacity than the Atlas. Korolev was able to demonstrate the first successful flight of an R-7 ICBM on August of 1957, allowing Khrushchev to announce to the world that Russia now possessed such a weapon. In reality, the R-7 ICBM was not deployed as a weapon until a year and a half later, February of 1959, after the warhead reentry problem had been solved. The American Atlas was also deployed 9 months later, in November of '59. The R-7 was the world's first real ICBM, or intercontinental ballistic missile, but was never successful as a weapon for practical reasons. It took some 20 hours to prepare it for launch, and it could not be stored in a defensive silo. Only about 10 of them were ever deployed as ICBMs at 2 locations, and the R-7 ICBM was retired from service in 1968, just 9 years later. The Atlas had a similar experience for similar reasons, retiring in 1965. However, the R-7 was to begin a new, long, and glorious career as a launcher of space vehicles. This career began with the previously mentioned launching of Sputnik 1 and its sister satellites in 1957. It continued with a series of 3 types of manned spacecraft, beginning with the one-person Vostok of Yuri Gagarin in April of 1960 and a succession of his cosmonaut brothers and one sister, Valentina Tereshkova. It continued to the 2- or 3-person Vashkov in 1963, which included Leonid's first spacewalk in 1965. Finally, in 1966, the 3-person Soyuz, fully functional, that means it had a bathroom, spacecraft was introduced, which still flies today. It's the only craft we have of getting astronauts to the International Space Station. These spacecraft are examples of Korolev's vision and ambitions for the exploration of space. From the beginning, the workhorse R-7 launch system was employed in many other space ventures by Korolev, often inspired by Tikhonov. Communication and navigation and spy satellites were orbited with the R-7. From 1959 to the 60s, versions of the R-7 were used to send the first spacecraft to impact the Moon and Venus. In the mid-60s, Korolev still had, in the R-7, the hardware to beat the U.S. to the punch. As a related side issue, as of today, September of 2019, an R-7-based Soyuz is the only means we have of putting astronauts and cosmonauts to travel to the International Space Station. And as of 2018, more than 1,840 R-7-based spacecraft have been launched. By far the most of any launch system, and it's still counting. In 1961, the situation began to change, when Kennedy's challenge to go to the moon began to focus, fund, and drive the U.S.'s manned space efforts. The Soviets would not accept the moon challenge for another 3 years, until August of '64. By then, the American Apollo program was well underway, and Korolev knew that he would be playing catch-up. Fortunately, he had been looking ahead and had a card up his sleeve in another spacecraft, the N-1, which he had originally envisioned for a three-man flyby mission to Mars. This project plan had been completed at Korolev's OKB-1 Bureau in 1961, and in September of '62, he had been given the go-ahead to start the preliminary development on the vehicle, which he hoped to adapt to a manned moon mission to compete with von Braun's Saturn V. In its L3 moon landing mission mode, the N1 weighed less than the Saturn V Apollo and produced more thrust but for a shorter time, giving it less lift capacity. Thus, the Soviet plan was to send only 2 men to the moon, one of whom would land. I inserted this picture here of the US space shot of Baikonur, which we took surreptitiously, and which was said to have triggered the decision to send Apollo 8 around the moon, because we thought the Russians were about ready to do it themselves. Korolev's plan to beat the US to the moon was doomed almost from the very start, though not from his lack of trying. In August of 1964, he was officially starting almost 3 years after the Americans. He faced many technical challenges, as well as political, organizational, and personal obstacles which would impede his progress. Because of political intrigue, the program was fragmented instead of a unified national focus on one goal, like here in the United States. He now had some competitors. Some of them had connections in Cholomoy, Yango, and Glushko, and the military, who introduced mission variations to the Soviet leadership, diluting resources from the main mission. The Soviet leadership was shaken up again in October of '64 when Khrushchev was deposed and Korolev had to reestablish his backing with yet another top dog, Leonid Brezhnev. Much of Korolev's efforts at this time frame was spent pleading for adequate funding for the moon landing program, while responding to political requests for yet more first feats, such as the first woman in space in June of '63, the first multi-person spaceflight in October of '64, or the first spacewalk in March of '65, none of which added value to the moon landing program, and all of which delayed the development of the 3-man maneuverable Soyuz spacecraft, a key element in the moon landing mission. Korolev's N1 L3 manned moon landing mission vehicle weighed too much due to crude electronics and older technology, and he had to make do with smaller engines, 30 of them, since Glushko had refused to develop the larger engines needed. There were some personality conflicts between Glushko and Korolev at this point. The inherent decrease in reliability with many engines to control, 30 of them, was dealt with by a primitive computer control system called KORD, K-O-R-D, which was an unproven technology and for which full-scale testing was not feasible for timing or budget reasons. NASA, on the other hand, from their beginning in 1958, had realized the importance of a much larger rocket engine and had begun development of the mighty F1 engine in January '59, which would finally be available for the Saturn V. Then, on December 15, 1965, to top it off, a Soviet manned circumlunar mission, which had been competing with Korolev's lunar landing mission and used completely different hardware, was approved. And in an effort to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution on time, it was put in Korolev's lap as well, adding to an already overwhelming crushing schedule. All of these problems had to be dealt with by a Korolev who was the final word on all major decisions and who was suffering from a bad heart and other medical issues, some from his days in the Gulag. On January 5th, 1966, Korolev entered the hospital for routine surgery of the removal of polyps from his rectum. He would observe his 59th birthday 7 days later in the hospital, and after complications during surgery, on January 14th, 1966, he died in the hospital. Korolev was the towering figure in the Soviet space flight program and had almost single-handedly been responsible for its successes through his grasp of of the technical, political, and administrative needs, and his remarkable leadership in the effort to beat the Americans into space. His accomplishments with Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin were responsible for the American response to the space race, and his loss from the Soviet program would be crucial. His replacement, Vasily Mishin, while talented, was not up to the huge challenge. Of the two key elements in Korolev's quest to beat the Americans to the moon, the giant N-1 rocket was unsuccessful in 4 launch attempts, and then canceled in 1976. While the Soyuz spacecraft, after a painful birth, the death of cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov in 1967, would go on to become the most successful spacecraft in history and is still being used today. The space race that Korolev had started, I submit, in 1957 with Sputnik, was won by the Americans on June 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong set foot on the surface of the moon. But I believe that the spirit of Sergei Korolev, the man who started it all, was a witness to that event. The legacy of Sergei Korolev is monumental, several of which are mentioned on this slide. He is revered as a national hero to this day in Russia, has museums, schools, streets, and even a city named after him. And so now I would like to add my musical tribute to the man who started the exploration of space, Sergei Korolev. One moment.
Can you ask Don to turn up the front?
I'm sorry?
Can you ask Don to turn up the lights in the front?
Could you turn up the lights in the front? I guess. You can hear me. I'm going to try to use this microphone. Whoa! I guess I might not turn it down just a hair. We're getting a little feedback. Some of you may recognize this melody, and I don't know if you can read the words. This turned into be a little bit longer than I thought. So
Jim?
Yes?
You might want to move your speaker out so it's not pointing right into the microphone.
But it's a different system, though. I think we'll get it here. Hello, can you hear me out there?
Yes.
Sing along if you'd like. Twas Stylenkowski space-like stuff inspired Korolev enough to start a rocket program that was new young. Then Stalin's stooges came and chased him to that nasty gulag place, and someone told him that old Stalin screwed you. Hallelujah, hallelujah, stuck it to ya. The Soviets were on the ball. After the war they gave their all to solve the problems of von Braun's V2. That German ingenuity was given not quite willingly for Korolev to use more power to you. Hallelujah. Raketin Flugja! Das ist gut, ja? Hallelujah. Then Korolev heard Khrushchev say, I need a better, cheaper way to use my atom bombs with which to do ya. He sent R7 into space, it came down in a different place. The first ICBM, now he can do ya. Hallelujah. Now he can nuke ya. Sock it to ya. Hallelujah. He sent that Sputnik skirt around. The earth had made a beeping sound. Of
exciting Russian technical, here's too young. It gathered praise around the earth, space travel had been given birth. But who the father was, they hardly knew ya. Hallelujah. This she knew ya, 'cause Sputnik's cool ya. Hallelujah. Yes, that Korolev, he was quite a guy. He looked right straight into your eye and listened well when he was talking to you. He lived to start that space flight stuff, but died before he'd done enough to beat the U.S. landing on the moon, yeah. Hallelujah. He was cool, yeah. He had blood like rocket fuel, yeah. Hallelujah. I've asked Diane to critique my talk, because she's the other expert here in the room. What about Diane?
I was wondering if you had any details about, say, Korolev's rapport with the cosmonauts, which is something that his successor
I do.
totally lacked.
One of the books I was fortunate enough to borrow from a friend of mine out there, who's into stamp collecting about Soviet space exploits, had a book written by 36 of the people who worked with Korolev. It's, I forget, it's like a $45 book. I wasn't willing to buy it, but he lent it to me for a couple of months. And it got first-hand comments from several astronauts or cosmonauts and many of the workers at the space launching programs and the engineers that worked with them. And it was a masterful testimony that somebody really made an effort on to get a personal look at the man. He was very, very, very close to the cosmonauts. I mean, they were very personal friends. And as a matter of fact, just several nights before he went in the hospital at the last, he had a dinner, had the Yuri Gagarin and one of the others over to his home and shared with him the story of his days in the Gulag and stuff like that. So he was very close to the cosmonauts. Any others?
That's great.
Yes, sir.
SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy seem to be somewhat similar in terms of multiple boosters. Do you have any thoughts on, relative to the R7? Any comments on that?
Well, the R7 certainly set some precedents, and it was masterful. I mean, it was an accident that it happened the way it happened, I think. But today's rockets are larger, they have lots more launch capacity, but many of them do use the packet design concept. So.
Yeah, they're generic, but they're so similar.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thanks a lot again. It's been a pleasure.